The Winchester family were the architects of an industrial slaughter that churned out over 700,000 rifles. They cleansed the American West and amassed a fortune of $20 million, a sum soaked in the blood of the frontier. But the exchange rate for that wealth was brutal. In just 15 years, the entire male line of the dynasty was wiped out. They believed they were paying a spiritual debt, but the math was far colder. The family wasn't being hunted by ghosts. They were being biologically exterminated by the very industry that made them rich. From infinite wealth to total extinction. The pathology of the Winchester fortune begins with a shirt manufacturer. Oliver Fisher Winchester, the patriarch of the bloodline, spent the first half of his life dealing in the soft margins of cloth and thread. He was a creature of commerce. However, Oliver possessed the predatory instinct of the quintessential 19th century capitalist. In 1857, he looked at the volatile landscape of a dividing America and recognized a grim economic reality. The future of the nation lay in arming its citizens. He liquidated his interests in the textile factory and acquired the assets of the failing volcanic repeating arms company. He ignored the nuances of ballistics. He obsessed over a single engineering problem that would change the face of homicide, the rate of fire. Before the Winchester era, the act of killing was a slow, deliberate rhythm. A soldier armed with a muzzle loader required 20 seconds to pour powder, ram the ball, and fire. This process allowed for pauses. It allowed for reloading. It allowed for a momentary suspension of violence where a target might escape. Oliver Winchester financed a machine that removed the pause. The Henry rifle and its perfected successor, the Winchester model, 1866, changed the physics of the battlefield. A single man could now fire 15 rounds of ammunition without taking the weapon from his shoulder. Forensic historians view this shift as the industrialization of murder. Oliver Winchester sold the ability to kill an entire squad of men in 12 seconds. The American Civil War and the subsequent Indian Wars provided an insatiable market for Oliver's new machine. Soldiers bought these weapons with their own wages, desperate for the advantage of volume fire. Oliver Winchester sat in his boardroom in New Haven, Connecticut, watching the orders pour in. He remained geographically and emotionally removed from the carnage. A regiment of soldiers opening fire meant his bank account swelled. A tribe of Sioux warriors mowed down by settlers meant the Winchester stock price climbed. He marketed the weapon as a peacemaker. In practice, it functioned as an instrument of genocide. The Winchester brand defined American expansion, an expansion paved with corpses. Oliver Winchester accumulated millions of dollars. He built a mansion and joined the political elite. Yet a metaphysical toxin attached itself to this money. The fortune was generated by the kinetic energy of bullets tearing through human flesh. Oliver dismissed the spiritual cost. He believed in supply and demand. He died in December 1880 of a sudden heart attack, his chest collapsing under the weight of his own physiology. He left behind a massive industrial empire and a son named William. He died thinking he had won the game of capitalism. In reality, he had merely set the stage for the systematic slaughter of his own lineage. The fortune passed to his son, and the bill for the blood arrived immediately. The transfer of the Winchester fortune was intended to follow the standard laws of primogeniture. The empire built by Oliver was destined for his only son, William Wirt Winchester. Born in 1837, William was the princeling of New Haven. He possessed the refined manners of the Connecticut elite, a stark contrast to the ruthless commercial drive of his father. In 1862, he cemented the family's social standing by marrying Sarah Lockwood Pardee, the Belle of New Haven. She was a woman of immense intelligence, fluent in 4 languages, and musically gifted. The union represented the perfect consolidation of New England wealth. It appeared on the surface to be the beginning of a dynasty that would rival the Astors or the Vanderbilts. Biology, however, ignored the bank accounts. The first fissure in the Winchester bloodline appeared in 1866. This year holds a grim significance in the family timeline. It marked the release of the Winchester Model 1866, the rifle that would industrialize warfare on the frontier. Simultaneously, Sarah gave birth to a daughter, Annie Pardee Winchester. The arrival of the child should have secured the succession. Instead, it introduced the family to a cruelty that money could not bribe. Annie fell ill almost immediately. The diagnosis was marasmus, a severe form of malnutrition characterized by energy deficiency. In the 19th century, this was a disease of the poor, a condition usually found in the slums where food was scarce. The irony here is forensic in its brutality. The granddaughter of one of the wealthiest men in America, living in a mansion staffed by servants and wet nurses, was starving to death. Her body could not process the nutrients it was given. The family hired the best physicians in New England. They surely spared no expense. Oliver Winchester's factories were churning out weapons that could drop a buffalo at 200 yards, yet he was powerless to stop his granddaughter's cells from withering. Annie died on July 24th, 1866. She was 40 days old. The death of Annie Pardee Winchester was the patient zero event for the family's psychological unraveling. Sarah fell into a catatonic depression. She kept a lock of the infant's hair and refused to let go of the grief. For the next decade, while the Winchester Repeating Arms Company expanded its market share and armed the settlers pushing west, the mansion in New Haven remained a mausoleum of silence. Sarah never conceived again. The womb of the Winchester dynasty was closed. The fortune continued to accumulate, fueled by the violence of the Indian Wars, but there was no new life to inherit it. The curse of biology struck again in 1880. Following the death of the patriarch Oliver, William Wirt Winchester ascended to the presidency of the company. He controlled a monopoly on rapid-fire death. He inherited the mansion, the patents, and the millions. He held the position for less than 4 months. William had contracted tuberculosis, known then as consumption. Forensic pathology describes tuberculosis as a slow drowning. The Mycobacterium tuberculosis bacteria invades the lungs, creating cavities in the tissue. The body attempts to wall off the infection with tubercles, but the bacteria consumes the host from the inside out. The victim coughs up blood and lung tissue, wasting away in a feverish delirium. It is a slow, agonizing death, diametrically opposed to the instant, mechanical death delivered by a Winchester rifle. William traveled to a sanatorium seeking the clean air that doctors prescribed as a cure. It was a futile gesture. The bacteria ravaged his system with the same efficiency that his father's rifles ravaged the indigenous tribes. In March 1881, at the age of 43, William Wirt Winchester died. The timeline of destruction is chilling. In the span of 15 years, the exact period in which the Winchester rifle saturated the American market, the family lost its future, Annie, its founder, Oliver, and its heir, William. The male line was extinguished. The boardroom in New Haven was full of men counting profits, but the Winchester home was empty of Winchesters. Sarah was left alone in the wreckage. She stood as the sole survivor of the carnage. She was a childless widow in her early 40s, possessing a level of liquidity that was almost incomprehensible for a single woman in the Victorian era. She inherited nearly $20 million in cash and assets, along with a 50% ownership stake in the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. Her daily income was approximately $1,000, roughly equivalent to $30,000 a day in modern currency. This money was radioactive. Every dollar that flowed into her account was a dividend from a bullet sold. Sarah, already fragile from the loss of her child, began to crack under the weight of this blood money. She looked at her empty house and her dead husband, and she realized that the science of the 19th century had failed her. Medicine had not saved Annie. Medicine had not saved William. The rational world offered her nothing but caskets. And so, the woman holding the checkbook of the arms dealer turned her back on the rational world. She looked for answers in the dark. She sought out a medium. In the depths of her mourning, Sarah Winchester turned her back on the Episcopalian God of her childhood. The church offered only silence and platitudes about God's will, an explanation that felt insufficient for the systematic annihilation of her entire family. She sought a more diagnostic answer. In 1884, Sarah traveled to Boston, the epicenter of the American spiritualist movement. To the forensic historian, spiritualism in the late 19th century was not merely a fringe superstition. It was a grief management industry born from the carnage of the Civil War. With 620,000 young men dead, a generation of mothers and widows was desperate to speak across the veil. Sarah Winchester was the ultimate client for this industry. She possessed unlimited grief and unlimited funds. She arrived at the doorstep of a medium known as Adam Coons. The session that followed is the pivot point where the Winchester legacy transitions from industrial history to psychological horror. In the darkened parlor, Coons purportedly channeled the spirit of her late husband, William. The message delivered was not one of comfort, but of indictment. The medium told Sarah that her tragedy was not a result of biological bad luck or bacterial infection. It was a matter of karma. The diagnosis was brutal in its logic. The medium explained that the Winchester fortune was tainted by the blood of every person killed by a Winchester rifle. Every Native American warrior shot on the plains, every Confederate soldier dropped at Antietam, and every victim of a frontier shootout had attached their spirit to the money. Sarah was told she was being hunted. The spirits had taken her daughter and her husband as payment, and she was next on the ledger. The diagnosis reframed her wealth. She was not rich. She was simply holding the blood money in escrow for the vengeful dead. However, the medium offered a plea bargain. There was a way to outrun the curse. The prescription was architectural. "You must build a home for them," the medium allegedly told her. "You must never stop building. If the hammers stop, you will die." This command acted as a psychological key, unlocking a latent mania in Sarah's mind. It gave her a task. It gave her agency. Instead of waiting to die of sorrow, she could work to survive. She was told to leave New Haven, the rational industrial East Coast, and travel west toward the setting sun, toward the very lands that her husband's rifles had cleansed. Sarah liquidated her assets in Connecticut. She did not act like a woman making a real estate investment. She acted like a fugitive. In 1884, she arrived in the Santa Clara Valley of California. She found an unfinished 8-room farmhouse standing on a massive plot of land. She bought it immediately. She did not hire an architect. She did not consult blueprints. She hired carpenters, masons, and laborers, and she gave them a single terrifying instruction: start working and do not stop until I tell you. This was the groundbreaking of the Winchester Mystery House. It was not designed to be a residence in the conventional sense. It was designed to be a machine. Sarah Winchester began to pour her $20 million fortune into lumber, redwood, and stained glass. Constructing a labyrinth intended to confuse the spectral assassins she believed were tracking her. She believed that the sound of the hammers acted as a heartbeat, keeping her alive. The neighbors in San Jose watched in confusion as the house began to metastasize, growing tumors of turrets, cupolas, and wings that defied gravity and logic. The transformation of Sarah Winchester was complete. The cultured belle of New Haven, the linguist and musician, had died along with her husband. In her place stood a tiny, veiled figure, roughly 4 feet 10 inches tall, crippled by arthritis and paranoia, sketching designs on napkins for staircases that led to nowhere. She had ceased to be a human being living in reality. She had become the warden of a prison for ghosts. The industrial efficiency that Oliver Winchester had applied to the manufacturing of rifles, Sarah now applied to the manufacturing of rooms. The factory in New Haven churned out the guns. The house in San Jose churned out the guilt. The hammers began to swing in 1884, and for the next 38 years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they would not fall silent. Why did the hammers never stop ringing for 24 hours a day? The backdrop for this relentless construction was the Santa Clara Valley, a landscape of agricultural tranquility defined by orchards and golden sun. Yet Sarah Winchester stood in stark contrast to this pastoral silence. She did not live there as a settler looking to farm. She existed as a refugee fleeing an invisible war. To the locals, she was an enigma, a woman with no husband, no children, but with a bank account that seemed bottomless. They did not know that she carried with her the immense blood-soaked fortune of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. Nor did they know that she was operating under a terrifying directive issued by a medium in Boston: build or die. The construction process began immediately, but it defied every convention of architecture and logic known to man. Typically, a wealthy heir building a mansion would hire a renowned architect, approve blueprints, and establish a timeline for completion. Sarah Winchester did none of these things. She fired the architects. She burned the blueprints. She essentially declared war on the concept of planning. She hired a team of local carpenters, masons, and laborers, offering them wages that were significantly higher than the market rate. In exchange for this generosity, she demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience to her whims. She became the sole architect of the project, but her designs were not drawn on paper. They were drawn from the chaotic landscape of her own nightmares. The most disturbing aspect of the Winchester house was not its shape, but its sound. For 38 years, from 1884 until Sarah's death in 1922, the property was a cacophony of perpetual construction. Sarah instituted a shift system that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The hammers never stopped. They swung through the heat of the California summer. They swung through the torrential winter rains. They swung on Christmas morning. To the forensic psychologist, this relentless noise was not about home improvement. It was a psychological defense mechanism. Sarah believed that the sound of the hammers acted as a sonic shield. As long as the house was in progress, as long as the structure was mutating and expanding, the spirits of the men killed by her family's rifles could not catch her. She was trying to outpace the supernatural with carpentry. The house became a living organism, a tumor made of redwood and shingles that metastasized across the land. It grew without a skeleton. Rooms were added onto rooms, wings were grafted onto wings, and towers were erected only to be torn down and rebuilt the next day. The neighbors whispered that the house sounded like a factory, and in a sense it was. It was a factory designed to process guilt. The sheer volume of material consumed was staggering. Sarah Winchester was spending approximately $1,000 a day on construction, a staggering sum that drained the family fortune with industrial efficiency. She bought entire shipments of rare woods, stained glass from Tiffany's in New York, and exotic chandeliers from Europe. But unlike a museum or a palace where these items are displayed for admiration, in the Winchester house, they were often hidden or destroyed. Expensive stained glass windows were installed in walls where no light could reach them. Precious parquet floors were laid, only to be ripped up the next week because the spirits disapproved of the pattern. It was a display of wealth that was aggressively anti-materialistic. The value of the object did not matter, only its utility in the ritual of construction. The methodology of the design was rooted in the occult. Every evening, while the night shift of carpenters sawed and hammered in the distance, Sarah Winchester would retreat to the séance room. This was the command center of her madness. It was a small windowless chamber in the center of the house, accessible only by a single door. Legend holds that she would sit alone for hours, communing with the spirits, receiving instructions on what to build next. The following morning, she would emerge with sketches hand-drawn on napkins or scraps of paper. These were the blueprints for the day. She would hand them to her foreman, a man named John Hanson, who had the impossible job of translating the hallucinations of a grieving widow into physical reality. Hanson would look at the sketches and often protest, pointing out that the staircase she drew had no destination, or that the chimney she requested would not draw smoke. Sarah would dismiss his logic with a cold, aristocratic finality. "Build it," she would say. "Do not ask why." This process resulted in a structure that was hostile to human navigation. The house was not built for the living. It was built for the dead. Sarah believed that the spirits who hunted her traveled in straight lines and were confused by complexity. Therefore, the house had to be a puzzle. She ordered the construction of hallways that narrowed until they squeezed the walker. She built staircases that descended 7 steps, only to rise 11. She installed doors on the second floor that opened outward into thin air, a deadly drop to the garden below. These were not mistakes, they were traps. They were architectural glitches designed to snag a vengeful ghost just long enough for Sarah to escape to the next room. Despite the obvious madness of the project, the local community in San Jose became complicit in the delusion. Why? Because the Winchester house was the greatest economic engine the valley had ever seen. In an era of economic depressions and uncertainty, Sarah Winchester was a one-woman stimulus package. She employed dozens of men for decades. She paid for their homes, their food, and their children's education with the blood money from the rifle sales. Suppliers of lumber and glass grew rich off her paranoia. They did not question why a woman needed 160 rooms for herself and her servants. They simply cashed the check signed Sarah L. Winchester. To the forensic historian, this creates a disturbing web of culpability. The entire town was feeding off the corpse of the Winchester fortune. They knew the money came from the manufacturing of death, and they knew the woman spending it was mentally disintegrating. Yet they kept swinging the hammers. They enabled her psychosis because it was profitable. The house grew into a monstrosity. At its height, it possessed 7 stories before the earthquake reduced it to 4, 160 rooms, 47 fireplaces, 17 chimneys, 2 basements, and 3 elevators. It was a sprawling, chaotic testament to the power of unaddressed trauma. It was a physical manifestation of a mind that had shattered under the weight of grief and guilt. Sarah Winchester had succeeded in building a structure that mirrored her own internal state, expensive, impressive, and completely, terrifyingly broken. As the 19th century bled into the 20th, the house stood as a dark monument in the California sunshine. It was a place where the logic of the Industrial Revolution went to die. Oliver Winchester had obsessed over efficiency and function. His daughter-in-law obsessed over chaos and dysfunction. She was using his money to dismantle the very rationality that had created it. The hammers kept pounding, a 24-hour drumbeat that echoed the rapid fire of the rifles on the frontier, warning anyone who listened that there is no such thing as a clean fortune, and that sooner or later the ghosts will demand a home. To step across the threshold of the Winchester Mystery House is not merely to enter a residence, it is to walk directly into the topography of a schizophrenic break. A forensic analysis of the floor plan reveals that the structure does not follow the rules of domestic living. It follows the logic of a foxhole. Sarah Winchester, the tiny arthritic warden of this fortress, was not concerned with aesthetics, comfort, or flow. She was concerned with evasion. She designed the interior of the house as a weaponized environment, a spatial puzzle intended to disorient, trap, and confuse the metaphysical entities she believed were hunting her. Every hallway that twists without reason, every door that opens into a wall, and every staircase that terminates in a solid ceiling is a tactical maneuver in a war that existed entirely within her own head. The most immediate sensation reported by visitors, both in the 19th century and today, is a feeling of profound claustrophobia and vertigo. This is intentional. Sarah manipulated the scale of the architecture to fit her own diminutive stature and to unsettle anyone, living or dead, who was larger than her. The hallways are unnervingly narrow, forcing a grown man to turn his shoulders to pass. The ceilings in certain wings drop low, creating a sense of compression. This was a hostile environment for the intruder. Sarah believed that the spirits of the soldiers and warriors killed by the Winchester rifle retained their human dimensions. By shrinking the house, she was creating a terrain where she had the advantage, a rabbit warren where the hunter could become the hunted. The most glaring evidence of this architectural pathology is the switchback staircase. In a normal home, a staircase is a tool for vertical conveyance, designed to move a person from one floor to another with efficiency. In the Winchester house, the staircase is a mechanism of delay. The switchback staircase consists of 44 steps, yet it only rises 9 feet. Each step is only 2 inches high. To climb it is an act of maddening inefficiency. You must take dozens of steps to achieve what should take seconds. While some historians attribute this design solely to Sarah's debilitating arthritis, the forensic psychologist sees a dual purpose. Yes, the shallow steps eased her physical pain, allowing her to shuffle between floors without lifting her knees. But the layout of the stairs, 7 distinct turns enclosed by high walls that block all visibility of the destination, serves a darker function. It destroys the climber's sense of direction. By the time one reaches the top, the sense of north, south, east, and west has been obliterated. If a vengeful spirit were tracking her, this staircase would act as a baffle, a confusing coil that bought her precious seconds to escape into one of the secret passageways hidden behind the paneling. Even more disturbing is the infamous stairway to nowhere. Located near the center of the house, these steps rise steeply, promising access to an upper level. Yet at the top they terminate abruptly into a solid wooden ceiling. There is no landing, no trapdoor, no secret exit. It is a dead end. To the rational mind, this is a mistake, a change of plans mid-construction. To Sarah Winchester, this was a decoy. She believed that spirits traveled in straight lines and expected logical outcomes. A ghost chasing her up the stairs would slam into the ceiling, trapped by its own expectation of a path. She was building architectural glitches, physical errors designed to cause a metaphysical short circuit. The paranoia escalated from confusion to potential lethality on the second floor. Here, visitors can find a door that looks perfectly ordinary. It has a handle, a frame, and is finished with the same expensive trim as the rest of the house. However, if one were to turn the knob and step through, they would not enter a bedroom or a linen closet. They would plummet 8 feet down into the kitchen garden below. This is the door to nowhere. Forensic analysis of the framing suggests this was not an unfinished balcony. It was a finished trap. Sarah Winchester operated under the belief that spirits could be tricked, but she also seemingly designed features that could kill a living human being. Whether this was intended to maim a physical intruder or simply a spirit trap that disregarded the laws of gravity is unknown, but it speaks to the total collapse of safety protocols within the house. The obsession with the supernatural had overridden the basic instinct for self-preservation. The house was riddled with these hazards: chimneys that stopped short of the roof, threatening carbon monoxide poisoning, floorboards that concealed viewing ports, and windows built into the floor. It was a house that hated its inhabitants. As the years dragged on, Sarah's psychosis began to manifest through numerology. She became fixated on the number 13, viewing it as a powerful talisman that could appease the dead. This obsession was not subtle. It was imprinted onto the very hardware of the home. She ordered custom-made drain covers with 13 holes. She installed 13 hooks in the seance room for 13 different robes, though she was the only occupant. She modified the steps on the staircases to total 13. The most egregious example of this compulsion involved a grand chandelier imported from Germany. Originally designed to hold 12 candles, Sarah ordered her carpenters to modify it. They drilled a 13th arm into the expensive metalwork, destroying the symmetry and the resale value of the object, simply to satisfy the ritualistic math. She planted 13 palm trees along the driveway. She signed her will with 13 signatures. To the forensic observer, this is a classic symptom of obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, fueled by trauma. Sarah believed that by arranging her environment according to this specific numerical code, she could impose order on the chaos of the spirit world. It was a magical thinking ritual. If she controlled the number of coat hooks, perhaps she could control the anger of the ghosts. The number 13 was not bad luck to her. It was a locking mechanism, a cipher that kept the demons at bay. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the house's interior is the misuse of incredible beauty. Sarah Winchester possessed the finest taste of the Gilded Age. She purchased vast quantities of Tiffany-stained glass, some of the most exquisite examples of American art nouveau ever created. Yet her usage of these masterpieces was pathological. She commissioned a custom window from Tiffany valued at $1,500, over $40,000 today. It was a stunning piece featuring a spider web design, a motif that Sarah felt a deep kinship with. To her, the spider was a symbol of her own life. She was the weaver, spinning a web of rooms to catch the flies, spirits, yet she was also trapped in the center of the web herself. When the window arrived, she did not install it in the grand ballroom where the sunlight could illuminate the glass. She installed it in a walled-off room where no natural light could ever hit it. The beauty was entombed. Another window, designed to refract light into a rainbow of prisms, was installed in a location where a wall was immediately built behind it. This was the architecture of denial. Sarah was hoarding beauty but refusing to let it function. It mirrors her relationship with her fortune. She had millions of dollars, but she could not buy joy, safety, or peace. She could only buy more wood, more glass, and more silence. As Sarah aged, her arthritis worsened, and the house became a testament to her physical agony. She constructed the Hall of Fires, a room containing vast numbers of fireplaces and heat sources. She believed that heat was conducive to spiritual activity, but practically, she was freezing. The image of the tiny veiled widow moving from fireplace to fireplace, warming her twisted hands while listening for the creak of floorboards, is the definitive portrait of the Winchester legacy. The house, by the turn of the century, had become a physical record of her deterioration. It was a museum of fear. Every crooked hallway was a synapse in her brain, firing the wrong way. Every door to nowhere was a thought that couldn't find a conclusion. She had built a monument to the victims of the Winchester rifle, but in doing so, she had walled herself in with them. She was the sole living resident of a city of ghosts, playing a game of hide-and-seek that could never end because the seeker was her own conscience. By the spring of 1906, the Winchester mansion had mutated into a structure that defied both gravity and sanity. It stood as a wooden Tower of Babel in the Santa Clara Valley, rising an astonishing 7 stories into the California sky. It was a chaotic skyline of cupolas, turrets, and observation towers that seemed to scratch at the heavens, a physical manifestation of Sarah Winchester's unlimited budget and unlimited fear. At this stage, the 66-year-old widow appeared to believe she had achieved a fragile détente with the invisible forces hunting her. The hammers were swinging 24 hours a day, the money was flowing like water, and the labyrinth was sufficiently complex to confuse the vengeful dead. She was the queen of a chaotic kingdom, secure in her belief that she could outbuild the curse. But in the pre-dawn darkness of April 18th, at exactly 5:12 a.m., the earth beneath California betrayed her. The great San Francisco earthquake, ripping through the San Andreas Fault with a magnitude of 7.9, struck the valley with the kinetic force of a bomb. To the geologists of the era, this was a tectonic event caused by the friction of continental plates. To Sarah Winchester, lying awake in her bed as the world began to scream, this was not a natural disaster. This was a supernatural ultimatum. This was the spirits breaking the treaty. The violence of the quake severed the house's architectural arrogance. The top 3 floors, the magnificent 7-story observation towers that overlooked the bay, snapped off like dry twigs and collapsed into the gardens below. Tons of redwood, slate, and brick rained down, crushing the perfectly manicured hedges and destroying the greenhouses. The main chimney, a massive column of brick running through the core of the house, toppled inward, smashing through the roof and destroying the grand ballroom, a room filled with thousands of dollars of Tiffany glass and rare hardwoods. The noise was apocalyptic, the sound of a multi-million-dollar fortress tearing itself apart. Sarah was sleeping in the daisy bedroom near the front of the house when the shockwave hit. The shifting foundation warped the frame of the house instantly. The walls twisted, and the heavy oak door to her bedroom jammed shut, sealing her inside. For several hours, the richest woman in California was trapped in a pitch-black box, choking on plaster dust, listening to the aftershocks rattle the bones of her broken home. She was buried alive in the very sanctuary she had built to keep herself safe. It took her servants nearly the entire morning to locate her, force their way through the debris, and pry the door open with a crowbar. When Sarah emerged, covered in white lime dust and trembling with terror, she did not survey the damage with the eye of a landlord worried about repair costs. She surveyed it with the eye of a theologian who had just received a message from hell. Forensic analysis of Sarah's behavior in the weeks following the earthquake reveals a profound and permanent shift in her pathology. A rational person would have hired structural engineers to repair the damage and rebuild the towers. Sarah Winchester did the exact opposite. She interpreted the earthquake as a direct punishment from the spirits for her vanity. She believed she had become too proud, spending too much time and money beautifying the facade of the house to impress the living, rather than focusing on its true function as a trap for the dead. The collapse of the towers was a sign that she had lost her way. To atone for this sin, Sarah issued a set of orders that baffled her workmen. She refused to repair the collapsed front section of the house. Instead, she ordered the carpenters to board it up with raw, unpainted plywood and heavy nails. The grand front doors, hand-carved from rare mahogany and valued at a fortune, were sealed shut. She declared that they would never be opened again in her lifetime, and they never were. She effectively amputated the public face of the mansion. From that day forward, the house turned its back on the world. Visitors, suppliers, and servants had to enter through side doors and service entrances. The mansion ceased to be a residence and became a fortress of penance. She left the damage in the daisy bedroom and the grand ballroom untouched. The rubble was cleared, but the cracks in the walls and the missing ceilings were left as open wounds. She wanted the scars to remain visible, a constant reminder of the spirit's power and her own vulnerability. The construction strategy shifted dramatically. No longer did the house reach for the sky. The 7-story towers were never rebuilt. Instead, the house began to spread horizontally, like a fungus consuming the land. She ordered the construction of more confusing lower-level wings, focusing on complexity rather than height. The unfinished nature of the house became a defensive strategy. By leaving rooms half-built with exposed studs and open floors, she was signaling to the spirit world, "I am still working. My task is not done. You cannot take me yet." With the upper floors destroyed and the front sealed, Sarah retreated into the geometric center of the structure, the nerve center of her existence, and the command post for the house's expansion became a small, unassuming chamber known as the Blue Room. To the staff, this was the seance room. To the forensic psychologist, this was the situation room of a war being fought entirely within one woman's mind. The Blue Room was constructed with the specific paranoia of a military bunker. It was located deep within the house, insulated from the outside world by layers of hallways and empty rooms. It had only one entrance. Sarah possessed the only key. No servant, no relative, and no workman was ever permitted to cross the threshold. It was a sterile zone, a vacuum where the barrier between the living and the dead was believed to be thinnest. If a servant was even suspected of trying to peek inside, they were dismissed immediately. The architecture of the Blue Room reveals the depth of Sarah's isolation and her obsessive need for control. Despite being in the interior of the house, it featured a window. However, this window did not look out onto the gardens or the sky. It looked down into the kitchen below. This was a tactical design choice, a classic panopticon effect. It allowed Sarah to spy on her staff without their knowledge, listening to their conversations and watching their movements. This is a classic symptom of the paranoid delusion that she was being poisoned or plotted against by the living, a fear that often accompanies extreme isolation and wealth. The room was furnished with a Spartan simplicity that contrasted with the opulence of the rest of the house. It contained a table, pens, paper, and a planchette, a tool used for automatic writing. But the most disturbing feature was a cabinet containing 13 colored robes. Every night, as the clock tower struck midnight, the witching hour, Sarah would unlock the door, select one of the robes, and vanish inside. She believed that wearing different colors allowed her to camouflage herself from malicious spirits or signal her rank to benevolent ones. She would remain in the room until 2 a.m., in total silence. What happened within those 2 hours was the economic engine that drove the entire town of San Jose. Sarah claimed to commune with the spirits, receiving architectural instructions directly from the other side. She believed that good spirits were guiding her, acting as supernatural architects who told her exactly where to place the next room to entrap the bad spirits. In the silence of the blue room, Sarah would sit with a pen, allowing her hand to move automatically across the paper. The sketches she produced were erratic, nonsensical, and physically impossible. She drew staircases that led to ceilings. She drew chimneys that stopped short of the roof, which, forensically speaking, created a deadly carbon monoxide hazard. She drew skylights to be installed in floors. These were not the mistakes of an amateur. They were the direct orders of the ghosts. To Sarah, a staircase that went nowhere was not a waste of wood. It was a mechanism to confuse a spirit that expected to go somewhere. A door that opened into a solid wall was a spirit trap. The next morning, she would hand these fever dream sketches to her foreman, John Hanson. Hanson, a practical man, would look at the plans and see madness. But he also saw the paycheck. He would instruct the crews to build exactly what was drawn. This is why the Winchester house feels so structurally hostile. It was designed by a mind that was trying to break the rules of physical reality. The blue room was the point of infection where the hallucinations became lumber and nails. The house was not being built for human inhabitants. It was being terraformed for entities that did not exist. The years following the earthquake were characterized by a grim, joyless endurance. Sarah Winchester ceased to be a person and became a spectral figure in her own home. The physical toll of her stress and age began to manifest. She was crippled by severe rheumatoid arthritis that curled her fingers into painful claws and bent her small frame. Walking became agony. To accommodate her failing body, she installed private elevators powered by hydraulic pistons, a rare and expensive luxury for the time. She ordered the construction of easy riser staircases, where each step was only 2 inches high, allowing her to shuffle between floors without lifting her feet. These architectural modifications were the only concessions the house made to the living. Everything else was for the dead. She began to wear a heavy black veil at all times, even when alone indoors. The Belle of New Haven, once celebrated for her beauty and musical talent, had completely erased her identity. She sought to become part of the house, a ghost before she was dead, indistinguishable from the shadows she feared. The servants reported that she moved through the house silently, appearing and disappearing like a phantom. The sound of the hammers was the only constant, a 24-hour drumbeat that assured her she was still alive. By the 1920s, the Winchester Mystery House had become a silent, sprawling necropolis of 160 rooms. It was a machine designed to process guilt, a physical manifestation of the trauma inflicted by the gun that won the West. Sarah Winchester sat alone in her blue room, night after night, listening to the wind rattle the boarded-up windows of the front facade. She was the warden, the prisoner, and the architect of a purgatory made of redwood. She was playing a game of hide-and-seek against her own conscience, spending millions to build a labyrinth, unaware that she had simply constructed a very expensive tomb for a woman who died inside decades ago. The shocking scientific evidence behind the collapse of the Winchester dynasty. On the morning of September 5th, 1922, a strange and terrifying phenomenon occurred in the Santa Clara Valley. For the first time in 38 years, silence fell over the Winchester estate. Since 1884, the property had been defined by a ceaseless industrial rhythm, the grinding of saws, the pounding of hammers, and the shouting of foremen. This noise had been the heartbeat of Sarah Winchester's existence. A sonic shield she believed was the only thing keeping the vengeful spirits at bay. But in the early hours of that September Tuesday, the heartbeat stopped. Sarah Winchester, the architect of the world's most famous labyrinth, had died in her sleep of heart failure at the age of 82. The reaction of the staff was immediate and superstitious. The carpenters, some of whom had spent their entire adult lives building rooms that would never be used, dropped their tools mid-swing. Legend and local history record that nails were left half-driven into the wood. This was not laziness, it was fear. The workers believed that the only reason they were safe from the ghosts was Sarah's patronage. With the warden dead, the containment field was broken. They fled the property, leaving the house in a state of suspended animation, a fossilized moment of madness frozen in time. To the forensic historian, the death of Sarah Winchester marks the transition from a tragedy of psychology to a tragedy of greed. The body was barely cold before the vultures began to circle. The heirs, nieces, nephews, and the trustees of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company descended upon the mansion. They were not interested in the architectural curiosity of the house. They viewed it as a nuisance, a sprawling pile of lumber that needed to be liquidated. Their eyes were fixed on the rumored fortune hidden within. For decades, stories had circulated that Sarah kept the bulk of the Winchester millions in gold bars, hidden in secret vaults dispersed throughout the 160 rooms. Before the looting could begin, the family had to contend with Sarah's last will and testament. The document itself was a forensic artifact of her disorder. Most wills are drafted by lawyers in precise, sterile language. Sarah's will was a chaotic manuscript, written in 13 separate sections and signed 13 separate times. This obsession with the number 13, which had dictated the number of bathrooms and the number of hooks in the seance room, persisted even into her legal afterlife. She believed that by encoding the document with this numerology, she could protect her soul during its transition. The contents of the will revealed the depth of her isolation. She left generous sums to her favorite servants, the people who had engaged in the charade of her daily life. She left money to the prompt care of her chaotic gardens. But conspicuously absent were large bequests to charity or public institutions. There was no Sarah Winchester Hospital or Winchester Library. The money had been consumed by the house. The will was the final ledger of a life that had turned inward, cutting off all connection to the outside world. The climax of the post-mortem phase occurred when the executors located the safes. Sarah Winchester was known to be paranoid about security. The house contained multiple safes, including a massive walk-in vault hidden behind paneling in the heart of the house. The heirs approached these safes with breathless anticipation. They knew Sarah had liquidated millions of dollars of stock over the years. They expected to find stacks of cash, bonds, gold certificates, or jewelry worthy of a queen. They hired professional safecrackers to drill through the heavy steel doors. When the first safe swung open, the room went silent. It was empty. They moved to the second safe. Empty. Finally, they cracked the main vault, the one Sarah had guarded most jealously, the one located in the Blue Room complex. Inside, they found the true treasure of Sarah Winchester. There was no gold. There were no diamonds. Instead, the shelves were lined with the macabre mementos of her grief. They found locks of hair cut from the head of her infant daughter, Annie, who had died 50 years prior. They found the obituary of her husband, William, clipped from a New Haven newspaper in 1881. They found crumbling letters from the 1860s. To the forensic psychologist, this is the most devastating reveal of the entire saga. The heirs were looking for the Winchester fortune, but Sarah had been guarding the Winchester tragedy. In her mind, the only things of value were the physical remnants of the people she had lost. The gold meant nothing to her. She had spent it by the bucket load to build the trap. The only thing she tried to save, the only thing she locked away in a steel vault to protect from the spirits, was the memory of the time before the guns killed everyone she loved. The treasure was grief. Disappointed and likely furious, the heirs moved to liquidate the physical assets immediately. They viewed the house not as a historic site, but as a liability. They brought in appraisers to value the furniture. The contents of the house were staggering in their quality, but terrifying in their quantity. It took movers 6 weeks, working 8 hours a day, to empty the house of its furniture. There were rail cars full of Tiffany glass Persian rugs and rare organs. However, the house itself, the structure, was deemed worthless. Appraisers looked at the chaotic floor plan, the stairs to nowhere, and the lack of a coherent blueprint, and declared it uninhabitable. No rational family could live there. It was a labyrinth, not a home. The heirs sold the property for a pittance, barely over $135,000. To put this in perspective, Sarah had spent over $5.5 million building it. The depreciation was absolute. The market value of madness is zero. The immediate aftermath of the sale revealed the cynicism of the era. The buyer was not a developer who wanted to tear it down, but an investor named John Brown, who saw a different kind of value. He realized that the story of the crazy widow and her ghosts was a commodity. Before the dust had even settled on Sarah's grave in New Haven, where she was buried next to her husband and child, Brown was already planning to open the doors to the public. Sarah Winchester's body was transported back to Connecticut to be interred in the Evergreen Cemetery. She was laid to rest beside William and Annie. The inscription on the central monument reads simply, "The Family." It is a final cruel irony. In death, she returned to the very place she had spent 38 years running from. She fled New Haven because the medium told her the spirits there would kill her. She built a fortress in California to escape the East Coast curse, and yet, the moment she died, her body was shipped back to the epicenter of the blood money. The silence of the hammers in San Jose was replaced by the silence of the grave in Connecticut. But the legacy she left behind was not silent. It was screaming. The empty safes, the half-driven nails, and the boarded-up doors stood as physical evidence of a life consumed by fear. The heirs walked away with what remained of the money, but they left behind the monument. And as the first tourists began to arrive at the gates just 5 months later, paying admission to gawk at the Mystery House, the final transformation of the Winchester legacy began. The tragedy had been privatized. The pain of a grieving mother had been turned into a roadside attraction. The Winchester rifle had industrialized death. The Winchester house industrialized the fear of it. For a century, the narrative of the Winchester family has been dominated by the vocabulary of the occult. It is a story told in the hushed tones of tour guides and the sensationalist prose of tabloids, filled with ghosts, curses, mediums, and vengeful spirits. Visitors to the mansion today are encouraged to look for cold spots and spectral figures in the hallways. However, the forensic historian does not bring a Ouija board to a crime scene. They bring a mass spectrometer. When we strip away the layers of Victorian superstition and analyze the Winchester legacy through the lens of modern industrial pathology, a far more terrifying reality emerges. The family was not being hunted by the angry spirits of Native American warriors or Confederate soldiers. They were being hunted by the periodic table. The true killer of the Winchester bloodline was not a metaphysical entity, but a chemical one. The specific agents of their destruction were mercury and lead, two neurotoxins that defined the arms industry and the construction industry, the two worlds that Oliver, William, and Sarah Winchester inhabited exclusively for their entire adult lives. Sarah Winchester inherited a fortune that was literally toxic. The family empire was built on a specific chemical innovation known as the metallic cartridge. Before the Winchester Revolution, firearms relied on loose powder and lead balls, a clumsy system that required time and dexterity. The Winchester repeater changed the face of warfare by utilizing a self-contained brass cartridge. However, the heart of this invention was mercury fulminate. This primary explosive was the standard for percussion caps in the 19th century, but it came with a lethal side effect. When handled or detonated, it released invisible neurotoxic vapors into the immediate environment. Oliver Winchester and his son William spent decades walking the floors of the factories in New Haven where this substance was mixed, poured, and settled. In the mid-19th century, industrial safety standards were effectively non-existent. There were no respirators, no ventilation hoods, and no understanding of bioaccumulation. The men who built the empire handled the prototypes with their bare hands and breathed the air of the firing ranges where thousands of rounds were tested daily. Mercury is a cumulative neurotoxin. It does not simply pass through the body. It settles in the lipids of the brain, the kidneys, and the central nervous system, slowly eroding the biological machinery of the host. The symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning are distinct and horrifying, historically known as Mad Hatter disease, because of its prevalence among hatters who use mercury nitrate to cure felt. These symptoms include a condition called erethism, characterized by severe irritability, pathological shyness, social phobia, and violent tremors. When we review the rapid biological decline of the Winchester men, the official causes of death begin to look suspicious. Oliver died of sudden heart failure, his body collapsing under stress. William died of tuberculosis, but the speed of his deterioration suggests an immune system that had been completely compromised. Chronic heavy metal exposure destroys the body's ability to fight off infection, turning a treatable respiratory illness into a death sentence. It is highly probable that the architects of the rifle were the first casualties of their own chemistry set. Their bodies were saturated with the very element they used to ignite their bullets, weakening their biology to the point where they collapsed under ordinary physiological stress. They didn't just sell the weapon, they absorbed it. If the men were poisoned by the making of the gun, Sarah Winchester was poisoned by the building of the house. This is the critical environmental factor that almost every ghost story ignores. For 38 years, from 1884 to 1922, Sarah Winchester lived inside an active, perpetual construction zone. She did not just oversee the work, she lived in the center of it. In the Victorian era, paint was not the benign latex substance we use today. It was a liquid suspension of white lead. Lead was the primary pigment used in the primer and finish coats of the high-end woodwork Sarah commissioned. It was prized for its durability and its bright, opaque finish. Because of Sarah's erratic and changing whims, the walls of the mansion were constantly being built, torn down, and rebuilt. Rooms were painted, sanded down, and repainted dozens of times. Every time a carpenter took a piece of sandpaper to a wall or a saw to a painted beam, millions of microscopic lead particles were released into the stagnant air of the mansion. Sarah, trapped in her heavy veils and confined to her unventilated blue room for hours at a time, was inhaling this toxic dust day and night. She was living inside a lead sarcophagus. Lead is a potent neurotoxin that operates with a sinister biological mimicry. It resembles calcium on a molecular level. The human body, mistaking the lead for calcium, absorbs it avidly and transports it across the blood-brain barrier. Once inside the brain, the lead attacks the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for impulse control, reasoning, and emotional regulation, and destroys the myelin sheaths that insulate the neurons. The result is a slow-motion short-circuiting of the mind. The symptoms of severe chronic lead poisoning in adults are a near-perfect match for the behaviors exhibited by Sarah Winchester. They include cognitive decline, profound confusion, memory loss, paranoia, hallucinations, and peripheral neuropathy, which causes severe pain and numbness in the extremities. When we overlay this toxicological profile onto the legend of the haunting, the supernatural events dissolve into a clinical diagnosis. Consider her famous debilitating arthritis. Sarah was crippled by a condition the doctors of the time called neuritis, which twisted her hands into claws and made walking agony. This is a textbook symptom of peripheral neuropathy caused by lead and mercury toxicity. Her nerves were literally dying, stripped of their protective coating by the heavy metals in her blood. The famous easy riser staircases with their 2-inch steps were not built to confuse a ghost. They were built for a woman whose nervous system was being eaten alive by her house, a woman who physically could not lift her feet more than a few inches without excruciating pain. Consider the visions and the voices, the hallucinations in the blue room, the instructions from the spirits, and the erratic automatic writing can be attributed to the neurodegenerative effects of mercury and lead. As the toxins accumulated in her temporal lobes, her reality fractured. The neurons in her brain were misfiring, creating auditory and visual hallucinations that she interpreted through the lens of spiritualism. She wasn't hearing the dead. She was hearing the sound of her own brain dying. The paranoia that defined her later years, the obsession with being spied upon, the installation of the window looking into the kitchen, the ceiling of the front doors, is a classic manifestation of lead-induced psychosis. The poison erodes the brain's ability to trust, replacing it with a primal chemical fear that assumes every shadow conceals an assassin. Even her physical appearance bears the marks of the poison. In her later years, Sarah lost all her teeth. While dental health was generally poor in the era, the total loss of teeth combined with her other symptoms points to the lead line, or mercury-induced gingivitis. The soft tissues of her mouth were likely rotting from the particles she inhaled and the toxins in her bloodstream. The very gums of the heiress were necrotic, destroyed by the same industrial materials that built her fortune. She was a walking catalog of heavy metal toxicity, a woman whose body was slowly turning into a repository for the periodic table's most dangerous elements. Therefore, the Winchester Mystery House is not a monument to ghosts. It is a 3-dimensional model of a poisoned brain. The chaotic architecture mirrors the cognitive disintegration of its architect. The dead ends, the loops, the stairs to nowhere, and the lack of structural logic are physical representations of neural pathways that have been severed. As the lead and mercury destroyed the connections in Sarah's mind, her ability to plan, predict, and execute logical designs collapsed. She built a house that looked like her mind felt, confused, broken, disconnected, and terrified. The labyrinthine hallways were not designed to trap spirits. They were the externalization of her internal maze, a projection of a mind that had lost the ability to navigate a straight line. The tragedy is compounded by the horrific irony that the cure she sought was actually the cause of her decline. The medium in Boston had allegedly told her, "Do not stop building, or you will die." In reality, the act of building was the very thing killing her. Every hammer blow kicked up more dust. Every new room required more lead paint. Every stained glass window involved lead solder. She was caught in a toxic feedback loop. She built to escape the madness, but the act of building released the toxins that caused the madness. She was driving the construction with a frantic energy, unaware that she was essentially constructing a gas chamber for herself. There is also the matter of the stained glass itself. Sarah Winchester purchased vast quantities of Tiffany glass, much of which contained metallic oxides to achieve those brilliant colors. She hoarded these items, handling them, breathing around them, living in a soup of heavy metals. The curse was environmental. It was the air quality. It was the water pipes. It was the paint chips. It was the accumulated industrial residue of the 19th century, concentrating in the body of a single, small woman who weighed less than 90 pounds. Sarah Winchester died in 1922, and no autopsy was performed to check for heavy metal concentration. The science of toxicology was in its infancy, and the deference to her immense wealth precluded such an invasive inquiry into her biology. But the circumstantial evidence provided by modern medicine is overwhelming. The Winchester family fortune was extracted from the earth in the form of lead and copper. It was processed using mercury fulminate, and it was spent on a house coated in white lead. The curse was not a metaphysical debt collected by the spirits of the indigenous tribes or the fallen soldiers. It was a biological debt collected by the laws of chemistry. The Winchester rifle was a weapon of mass destruction in more ways than one. It killed its targets with high-velocity bullets, and it killed its creators with molecules. Sarah Winchester was the final victim of the family business. She spent 38 years running from ghosts, hiding behind veils and locked doors, never realizing that the killer was in the paint on the walls, the dust in the carpets, and the very air she breathed in her sanctuary. She was not haunted. She was intoxicated. The madness that fueled the legend was simply the physiological scream of a brain drowning in metal, a tragedy of industrial hygiene masquerading as a ghost story. As we close the forensic file on the Winchester dynasty, the final verdict is not one of ghosts, but of a brutal biological and moral cause and effect. The story is often framed in popular culture as a battle between a woman and the supernatural forces of the afterlife. However, the evidence suggests a battle between a family and their own product. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company released two toxins into the world: kinetic energy and heavy metals. Both of these toxins return to destroy the creators with a mathematical precision. The kinetic energy, the bullets fired from the model 1873 and 1866 rifles, cleansed the American West. They secured the land for the settlers, but they created a psychological burden of guilt that shattered Sarah's mind. She was the sensitive antenna that picked up the signal of the slaughter. While the men in the boardroom counted the profits, Sarah felt the weight of the bodies. Her mental breakdown was, in a sense, the only moral response to the scale of the violence her name had unleashed. The heavy metals, the lead and mercury used to manufacture the ammunition and subsequently to build the house, destroyed the biological integrity of the family. Oliver Winchester died of sudden heart failure, his body worn out by the stress of the industry. William Winchester died of tuberculosis, his immune system likely compromised by years of exposure to fulminate in the factories. Sarah Winchester died of heart failure after decades of neurodegenerative torture, her brain eaten away by the very environment she built to save herself. There is no need to invoke the paranormal to explain the fall of the House of Winchester. The horror is entirely terrestrial. It is the definitive story of what happens when a fortune is generated by instruments of death. The money extracted from the violence of the frontier did not buy freedom. It bought a prison. It bought a 38-year construction project that served no purpose other than to distract a dying woman from the silence of her empty nursery. Today, the Winchester Mystery House stands as a disjointed wooden anomaly in the middle of modern San Jose. It is surrounded by the sprawl of Silicon Valley, hemmed in by shopping malls, movie theaters, and freeways. Yet, it remains the most powerful architectural metaphor in American history. It stands as a physical testament to the cost of the arms trade. It is a house built by a woman who was trying to outrun the consequences of her name, a woman who believed she could pay off a blood debt with carpentry. In the final analysis, Sarah Winchester failed. She could not build fast enough to escape the toxins in her blood or the grief in her heart. The hammers stopped, but the legacy of the gun did not. The Winchester rifle is still an icon of American violence, celebrated in Western movies and gun shows, and the Winchester house is still an icon of American madness, celebrated in horror movies and Halloween specials. They are twin monuments to the same tragedy, the belief that technology and money can solve any problem, even death. The curse was real, but it wasn't ghosts in the hallway. It was the lead in the paint. It was the mercury in the primers. It was the blood on the money. The Winchester family drank from a poisoned chalice, and they spent their final years building a labyrinth to hide the fact that they were dying. The ghosts didn't need to hunt them. The house itself was the weapon. The collapse of the Winchester dynasty was a convergence of biological failure and psychological disintegration, driven by the toxins they unleashed upon the world. The house always wins. The Winchester family attempted to monetize death, but death ultimately monetized them. They are the cautionary tale of the American dream curdling into a nightmare, proving that you cannot build a home on a foundation of bones, no matter how much redwood you nail over the cracks. And in the silence of the Blue Room, if one listens closely, past the noise of the tourists and the traffic, one does not hear the moans of the dead. One hears the shallow, rattled breathing of a woman slowly suffocating in a box of her own making, waiting for a forgiveness that would never come.